17:30 Uhr, willkommen weiterhin auf Stage 7, zweiter Tag hier bei der Media Convention, auch im Rahmen der Republika. Schön, dass so viele da sind und ich finde es toll, ich werde ganz viel angeguckt, ganz viele sind aufmerksam dabei, jetzt auf dem folgenden Thema zu lauschen, kann aber auch einfach damit zu tun haben, dass bei vielen der Handy-Akku schon inzwischen schlapp gemacht hat um 17:30 Uhr. Naja, auf jeden Fall kann ich euch ein Kompliment machen, ihr seid das fantastischste Publikum, was ich hier bisher gesehen habe heute auf der Republika. Also erstmal dafür von mir einen Daumen hoch. So, muss ich schon mal sagen. Ist allerdings auch, damit hätten wir die erste Fake News jetzt schon mal über die Bühne gebracht. Fake News ist das Thema, was uns jetzt in den nächsten 60 Minuten beschäftigen wird. Und ehrlich gesagt, da muss ich sagen, das ist auch ein Thema, was mir sehr am Herzen liegt, denn ich komme ja von der Rheinischen Post. Da muss ich sagen, im Thema, gerade auch im regionalen und lokalen, war ja auch schon hier heute im Laufe des Tages auf der Bühne Thema, ist das ein Phänomen, wo ich dachte, interessant, dass das vor allen Dingen auch das Thema Fake News im Regionalen so Wurzeln schlägt oder auch so bei so Nischenthemen. Deswegen bin ich gespannt, was wir hier gleich bei unserem Panel erleben werden und auch was darüber gesprochen wird. Ich habe erst noch mal so einen kurzen Housekeeping-Hinweis. MCB17, unser toller Hashtag, den ihr gerne mitnutzen dürft, ist auch heute kostenfrei. Außerdem haben wir einen schönen Service. Ihr werdet gleich nicht nur die Namen der Gesprächsteilnehmer sehen, sondern direkt daneben den Twitter-Namen. Ja? Dabei müsst ihr nicht erst kompliziert suchen. Die Arbeit haben wir schon erledigt hier vom Praktikanten. Also das ist schon alles gut erledigt worden und das ist, glaube ich, auch eine gute Geschichte. Werde ich mir mal für eine eigene Veranstaltung demnächst auch abgucken. Also, schön, dass es jetzt losgehen kann, würde ich sagen, ist alles geregelt und ich freue mich, dass der Herr Huber auch schon da in den Startlöchern steht. Joachim Huber vom Tagesspiegel ist dort Medienredakteur, muss ich noch dazu sagen, finde ich deswegen toll, dass er auch da ist, weil es natürlich auch von einer Regionalzeitung ist. Herzlich willkommen und viel Spaß jetzt mit Herrn Huber.
Vielleicht ganz kurz, der Tagesspiegel versteht sich natürlich nicht als Regionalzeitung, sondern als Hauptstadtzeitung. Das war schon die erste Fake News. Dann bin ich Ressortleiter Medien und ich Medienredakteur Nummer 2. Aber ab jetzt gibt es nur noch Wahrheiten. Meine Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen. Wir werden das Ganze in Englisch veranstalten. Deswegen darf ich gleich beginnen mit einer kleinen Einführung. Und dann kommt Herr Kleis-Nielsen und dann werden wir uns hier versammeln und dann geht's los. Ich darf Sie noch darauf aufmerksam machen, wir haben links und rechts Mikrofone. Wenn Sie also Fragen haben oder wollen protestieren, dann nutzen Sie die Mikrofone. Sie müssen nur freundlicherweise ein Handzeichen geben. Okay, so, welcome everybody. I'm still Joe Huber from the Tagesspiegel. You might remember 11th of January 2017, President-elect Donald Trump held a press conference where he battled CNN reporter Jim Acosta. Acosta attempted to ask the question. Trump refused at once. Quote, not you, Trump said. Your organization is terrible. Your organization is terrible. Quiet, quiet. Acosta asked again and again. Since you are attacking our news organization, can you give us a question? Trump, I'm not going to give you a question. You are fake news. And here we are, right in the middle of our panel, fake news and the credibility debate. How does journalism cut through? I'm very pleased that Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen will hold the Impulse presentation. Rasmus Nielsen is Director of Research at the Reuters Institute for Journalism at the University of Oxford. Rasmus, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Joachim, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity for the organizers to speak here today. I live in the hope that you won't fact-check my presentation as carefully as you did the introduction to yourself. But if you do, and if you spot me in any inaccuracies or outright lies, do let the audience know. I, too, am part of a profession that prides itself on transparency and accountability and professional critique. So I'm here to offer, really, if you will, just a brief provocation to kick off this discussion around how we think about fake news. And today I want to talk about how we might think about the relationship between fake news and what, for lack of a better word, perhaps some of us would like to call real news, news produced by professional journalists with all its imperfections, but also with all its many virtues, and really ask, if you will, this question of what is the main problem really here when we confront this issue of fake news around the world? My premise here is that if we want to understand how people engage with news, we need to start from the point of view of the audience. No one wants to be fooled. Nobody wants to be fed false and fabricated information, whether this information is produced for profit, the famous examples of the Macedonian teenagers churning out stuff because there is advertising that can be sold around this stuff, or for that matter, by state-backed disinformation campaigns that are funded to influence politics or create or destabilize the political situation in other countries. No one wants to be fed this kind of false or fabricated information. So I think the question is, if we start from that premise that there is no demand for fake news, how did we end up in a situation where fake news is a real concern? One part of an answer, I think, to that is to think about why we are having this very animated discussion in the first place, which I think is not solely about fake news in itself. I would offer to you that the timing here is not accidental. We are having this discussion in part because we are living in a world that is changing and where we had some surprising and for some uncomfortable political events, like, for example, in the country that I call my home now and where I live happily, the UK, the results of the referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. This was for some a both surprising and very uncomfortable outcome, disorienting perhaps for parts of the media establishment of the political elite, as it was for me indeed personally, or for that matter the United States, where I lived for a long time, another country that I was very proud and privileged to be part of for a long time, where the election of Donald Trump have had many people looking for answers. And I think if we think about journalism as a profession, but also more broadly people like myself, white, well-educated, relatively affluent, perhaps more appreciative of the establishment as it exists and the order of the world as it is, than some others. It's tempting, if you will, to look for some of these answers in changes in the media and changes in technology because it lets politicians and other established institutions off the hook. If Trump won because of fake news on Facebook, and not because of, for political reasons, or because of the enormous amounts of free airtime that he got as a candidate on American television, then the Democratic Party and mainstream American journalism have fewer uncomfortable questions to answer. So I think that's part of the backdrop of why we're having this discussion around fake news right now, is that it lends itself to a way of thinking about the world that means we don't have to question institutions that many of us, even if we also appreciate their imperfections, appreciate, support, and see as benign. But not everyone agrees. Now, I want to be absolutely clear here that there is no question that there is fake news out there. There is false and fabricated information that is peddled, again, as said, by state-backed actors of various sorts to destabilize the political situation in many different countries. It is also clear that there are people who produce false information for profit. I think it's also clear that there are some people who spread things that are, at least charitably, at best, misinformation, or at least very, very partisan, so partisan as to be perhaps not entirely factually based, for political reasons that are, from their own point of view, principled, whether it's on the left or on the right. So there is fake news out there. But we're also having this discussion because of some very real and often confusing and overwhelming for many people changes in how we find and access news. A new world that is disorienting for established institutions of all sorts. So, as all of you, as you are working in your professional life, are well aware, we are moving very quickly towards a world in which established media of print and broadcast, while still important for older generations, are far, far less important for younger generations. And we are moving towards a more digital, more mobile, and more social media environment than the one most of us grew up with. So this is a chart from the Reuters Institute Digital News Report that aggregates the responses given by survey participants all over the world in 26 countries in last year where they're asked to identify the different sources that they use for news, and then from the sources that they use, identify the one that is their main source of news. And we have broken it down here by generation, so you can see that, of course, there are still older generations, my parents' generation, for whom television is still king. 53% identify this as their main source of news. But when you look at younger generations, you see a very, very clear shift towards digital, and in particular now towards social media. So now in 2016, last year, for the first time amongst the 18 to 24-year-olds, more people named social media as their main source of news than named television. So this is after half a century, if you will, of television being the dominant platform for informing the public, to a situation in which by now a plurality of a younger generation turns to social media. And in this environment, it's easier to publish any kind of information, whether it is the highest standards of factual reporting, whether it is the most sophisticated and thoughtful pieces of commentary on opinion writing, whether on the left or the right or some entirely different ideological perspective, or whether it is false and fabricated. Any kind of information is easier to publish in this environment. But publishing is not the same as finding an audience. The fact that there is fake news out there and false and fabricated information out there is not in itself prove that these things deeply influence our public life. To understand that, we need to understand how the audience engage with this stuff, whether they engage with this stuff, how they navigate this environment where there's so much more material than any of us could have imagined growing up. We understand the political and economic incentives behind fake news well enough, but do we really understand the audience perspective on this? Do we really understand how people navigate this environment and how they engage with it? So part of the question here really is, for me, is how do people navigate news in this much more distributed environment where platforms like social media are much more central, in particular for younger generations? So I'm a researcher, so I'm interested in evidence-based answers to these questions. I'm less interested in sort of asserting who's to blame, so we try to find out. So I'm going to give you some examples of how people navigate this environment, some focus groups we did last year, and I'm going to use examples from a focus group we did in New York City with younger media users. So the moderator asked the question, so what do you trust then in Facebook as an example, as a news source? And then the first answer, I think, is the one that many people in this room secretly fear. I usually just click on things. Like, this is the fear, right? Is that people have a relatively undiscriminating approach to information in this environment. So there is a lot of crap out there, if you'll excuse my French, and people usually just click on things. But I'm here to tell you that this is not how most people navigate news on social media or more broadly in a changing media environment. So when we follow up, when might you click on something when you don't know? What we're told really in one sentence here from a focus group participant is what years and years of media research too suggests is how people actually navigate news in a more distributed environment. If it was shared by somebody who I trust, depending on where it comes from. I know the majority of sites that everyone recognizes, but if it's something that's interesting and shared by somebody whom I'm close with and trust, ... This is where we click. So people use social cues, somebody who I trust. They use source cues, major sites, the ones that everyone recognizes. And they click on things that interest them, something that's interesting. This is documented by years of research. People don't approach this environment in a naive way, clicking on every link that pops up in their feed or in their search results. People approach this with what a colleague of mine and myself in a piece of research we're working on called generalized skepticism. People have most people, not everyone, but most people have a healthy skepticism of all the different ways in which information is presented to them in this environment, whether it's by professional editors and journalists, or for that matter, whether it is content that is filtered by social media ranking algorithms or search algorithms. They may not understand these processes. They almost certainly do not understand these processes. I don't understand these processes, in particular the algorithmic ones, but we should remember that most people didn't really understand editing either, so they may not understand how they work, but they are not naively embracing them either. People in general navigate these things with some skepticism on the basis of cues, including social cues, source cues, and their personal interest. So here, if you will, I think is the backdrop to the whole discussion around fake news, which is, why did we get to a place where the way in which people who navigate news in this way encounter information has created a space where some people may turn to fake information? Why is it that if people go by social cues and source cues and interest, that they don't always turn to professional journalism? I think one part of the answer to that question is the question of whether people trust news. So again, this is from the survey and the data we have from last year. This is the people who say on a scale from 1 to 5 that they have a lot or some trust in news, in most news, most of the time. And in some countries like Finland and actually Germany, the results are, pretty encouraging for people who are journalists and people who believe in the purpose of journalism with all its imperfections and many shortcomings, that it is trustworthy. In that, broadly speaking, half of the adult population say that you can trust most of news most of the time. Significantly fewer amongst younger generations than older generations, but still. And then, of course, there are other countries in which the picture is rather different. The United States, where a third of the adult population say that you can trust most news most of the time. And a country like Greece, where a fifth says it, and one wonders who are these people who say that you can trust most news most of the time. And indeed, what we find in general is that these are environments where the low trust that are highly politically polarized, and where you have a long-running and broad-based crisis of confidence between mainstream institutions, whether political parties or governments or interest groups and the media and the population. This is nothing new. But this is the backdrop, is that for many people, news is not trustworthy, so why turn to it? The other part of the backdrop here, I think, is the question about interest. This is another set of quotes from the same focus group in New York with younger participants, 20 to 34-year-olds. I want to get a sense of what you think of these. So we gave them a sample of different news organizations, including the New York Times. So what do you think of the New York Times? What are your associations? OK, what do we get? Great reputation, sometimes boring. Just historical. They've been around for a long time. OK, well, it's sort of a heritage industry. They don't really cover things that interest me, the New York Times. And I think here, we have a much broader backdrop for the discussion around fake news, which is really in part about fake news, but is also about the space that's been opened up as a significant minority of the population, and perhaps in some countries where this crisis is very deep, perhaps in some countries a majority of the population, do not feel that what we in this room might think of as real news produced by professional journalists, do not feel that this speaks to things that they find relevant and interesting. That they don't feel that they can trust the news produced by professional journalists. And if then, on top of that, over time, we come to a situation where people live their lives in communities where everyone around them share these views and don't find that real news is relevant and interesting, trustworthy, and therefore don't engage with it and don't discuss it, you have a vicious circle in which people will turn away from news. And it is through that turning away, in my view, that we open up a space for fake news. A space where people who come together create their own definitions of what's happening and their own explanations for why this is happening, and turn to sources that confirm this because they don't find the ones that others might rely on credible, interesting, relevant, or news sources that speak to their issues. So I return to the premise here. No one wants to be fooled. They don't go into this news because it's fake. They go to it if they don't find anyone else who speaks to the issues and their interests and the positions that they have. If they don't find anyone else they can trust, if they don't find anyone else who speaks up for them, and this will be reinforced if people around them feel the same. All these issues can be reinforced by social media algorithms and by search engine algorithms. But fundamentally, there is a problem here, too, that real news organizations, real journalists have to take on. And I should say that our data suggests that in Germany, these problems are not, at least today, as pronounced as they are in the United States. German politics is not nearly as polarized as politics is in the United States. The levels of trust in mainstream institutions, whether politics or the government or the media, are not nearly as low in Germany as they are in the United States. You don't have the kind of deep-seated public crisis that has inflicted American political and public life by now for a rather long time. But that does not make the underlying challenge any less pressing. As we move towards a more digital, mobile, and social media environment where new generations navigate news in new ways and don't always find that established media and existing forms of journalism speak to them, to their interests and to their concerns, where people might feel that much professional journalism is written and produced by older men and for older men and about older men. Journalists have to take this seriously. Journalists have to take this potential crisis seriously if they want to combat fake news, which is the agenda, if you will, and challenge right now, but also more broadly if they want to renew their public role, their profession, and perhaps the business behind it, because all of that is premised on its connection with the public that journalism aims and claims to serve. Journalism exists in the context of its audience, and if we don't start from that premise and address the problems that more and more members of the public, of that audience, experience that journalism does not in fact serve their interests, does not in fact reflect their lives or address the issues they care about, then we have already lost. Thank you very much.
So, bitte sehr. Thank you very much, Rasmus. Please. Going to the stage. Und die Herren sitzen außen. Das ist ganz ungewöhnlich vielleicht. Jim, you may. Yeah. The ladies are in the middle and
yeah.
So, the water is fresh, it's Berlin original. So, here we are. The stage, may I introduce the other participants? Barbara Hans, Editor-in-Chief Spiegel Online. Nidal Sala Eldin, Head of Social Media, Welt N24. Maren Unger, Co-Founder and Editor-in-Chief of Perspective Daily, and Jim Egan, Chief Executive Officer, BBC Global News Limited, and Rasmus. So, ladies and gentlemen, if I may ask what we have heard about Rasmus, do we talk too much about fake news and not enough about real news? What do you think, Mrs. Hans?
I think it's true. I think we do talk far too much about fake news and not about the underlying problems. I think if we talk about fake news, a lot of the time we basically have or should talk about trust in media, trust in politics, and the mistrust that journalists often bring about towards their audience, because sometimes we don't trust our audiences and the other way around.
What do you think, Nidal?
Yes, I would absolutely agree with Barbara. We have a problem of credibility, and I think it's too granular to just consider fact checks and singular false reports we're reading about. You have to consider it in a bigger context, and we have much bigger fish to fry, actually.
Mm-hmm. And Marin, what do you think?
Well, I would have to talk longer about Perspective Daily, because, but I'm trying to keep it short, of course, because the whole idea of Perspective Daily is based on creating something that is based on trust. So every aspect of our work was based on trust, and that was long before we started to talk about fake news on a larger scale, so to say. And I think that we are actually not in a credibility crisis. It's just that we are creating this credibility crisis ourselves by talking about it all over again. So in principle, we could also maybe say, let's not talk about fake news today, but let's talk about news and how we create something that is trustworthy. And that will be more constructive, because we are doing constructive journalism, because then we are looking at what we want to achieve and not only the problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if I may ask Jim, that's the wrong panel at least, or? There's no fake news, there's no problem with fake news, everything's fine, and the BBC is the finest.
I mean, my view is fake news is unquestionably a serious issue and something we need to take very seriously within the industry, but it may possibly be slightly overstated. And you asked me before we came on whether people in the UK are as hysterical about fake news as they may be in other countries. And I think that Rasmus was right when he said, you know, the media may be, not for the first time, taking itself a bit too seriously here. Because actually, what's really happening is that in the real world that we are supposed to be reporting, there are seismic political, economic, and social changes going on. That is the real issue for us to report. You know, if you just take what happened in France on Sunday, which seems to have sort of blown over within the space of a news cycle to be not very interesting. You know, you had someone of his age who has never had elected office, who represented a party that was less than a year old. For the first time since the founding of the Fifth Republic, you have someone neither from the Gaullist nor the Socialist Party becoming president of one of Europe's major powers. Now, if Le Pen had won on Sunday, we would be tearing ourselves apart, saying the media has screwed up and failed here, and you know this is something that's our responsibility. But you know, it is incredible what happened in France last weekend. It's incredible what happened in the US last year. It's incredible what happened in the UK, where, you know, again, we are going to the polls for a nation which is embarking on probably a decade-long process of rediscovering itself and going through political realignment. And these are the real stories that we need to be telling to our audiences. We need to be holding our nerve, I think, recommitting ourselves to real news, and trying to help people understand the genuinely historical events that we are living through, and not tying ourselves up in knots with introspection about fake news.
So if I may ask the professional journalists on the stage, are you flagging out fake news? Are you keen on just busy with the real news? Do you have something like this on Welt N24?
You mean like a special unit that is specialized in?
A unit, and maybe just on the website, so there will be a certain sign. This is fake news. Are you revealing fake news, or are you just interested in real news?
We're actually interested in real news, and we do not have a debunking unit per se, a fact-checking unit. Everybody who works at the company and works in an editorial capacity is responsible for checking whatever story they're working on. So we consider it to be a unique journalistic quality that you have to have. It's a journalistic activity, and there's no separate unit specializing in this.
Mm-hmm. And Mrs. Hans, what about Spiegel Online? Do you have a special unit, task force for fake news?
No, we don't have a debunking unit either, but we do have the fact-checking department with Der Spiegel for decades now. Mm-hmm. So this is nothing new, really, and I think one should be careful about focusing too much on debunking fake news, because whilst doing that, you make them really big, right? Because there's always kind of dilemma which you have to think about. What is worth being debunked, really, and what is just nonsense? Mm-hmm. And telling people, look, this news is no news, means we make it news. So that's a bit complicated.
Mm-hmm. And when the users or viewers or whoever it may be, is calling and say, this is fake news, do you ask them, how do you know that this is a fake news? You are talking to the people calling Spiegel Online or maybe Welt N24?
Yes, actually we do get many comments, many emails, many messages, so not everything is visible. Many of the things that we're getting and that we're replying to are invisible. And we have many readers asking us, hey, I've read this story on this blog XY. Is this true or not? And if it's true, why are you not reporting on it? Mm-hmm. And we do make it a point to answer to these comments that we get and tell the people, okay, no, this is not a credible source, or we try to explain to them why this is not a main story. I think we have a bigger, to consider it in a bigger context. Our work, the journalistic work, the operation, the processes in newsrooms throughout the Republic, I think everywhere basically, we know what we're doing, and for us it's clear, okay, this is a story and this is not a story, but the reader many times does not know that. So we have to make it a point to give the readers a view into how we work and why the story from Hanover or a small town, for instance, has not made its way as a top story on Welt or on Spiegel Online, for instance. And this is something we have to explain. And I think this is something we have to think about much more and be much more active in that area.
And are you successful in persuading the audience, the viewers and users, or are they still mistrusting?
So from the feedback that we are getting, many readers actually appreciate that they get an answer from the page, that they get additional information, because many of the times, most of the time, we're very busy and we don't have time to write very lengthy emails explaining every single process. So what we do as well is, for instance, give them additional information, links, and the feedback we're getting is very positive, but of course, you have to be realistic. You cannot change everyone's perspective. You have to try to reach the people that are maybe doubting or that have open questions and that are still available for feedback. This is the point.
I see. But what about the daily business? I have read that there are almost 20,000 postings are coming to Welt N24 daily, so nobody can deal with it, oder?
Yes. So we have a system how we read and browse through the comments and navigate them. So every single comment that gets written on our Facebook page goes into an inbox. It's like the principle is like a Gmail inbox where you have a hub where all of the comments go in. And then you have topics. This is something you always have to be aware of. There are some hot topics where you know things will go sour very quickly if you don't answer. And then there are some topics that are actually, there's no criticism or no explosive discussion going on. So you have to know, and this is what everybody in my wonderful team knows, okay, this topic, I have to go in there right now. It's about racism, for instance. We have to make sure that we take position, that we're in the comments. And then there's a story about a new cell phone or a new WhatsApp feature that is not as relevant to moderate right now. Yeah.
So Maren, you have founded Perspective Daily, another kind of journalism. You may explain it's constructive journalism. It's all about facts. Are you very successful, more than successful? Are you the future of journalism?
Well, maybe I have to say that I'm not a traditional journalist by training, but I'm actually a neuroscientist. So what I did for 10 years is looking at the brain, and I think this is what we need to look at more, not that we actually all have to look at brains, but that we have to use the knowledge we got from neuroscience, from psychology and behavioral sciences, because that's not only relevant for disease like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on, but it's actually relevant for society and for media and how we consume news and how our brain and our head and whatever's in our body consumes, interprets, and then acts basically on these information, on information, but also on something which might be wrong or right. Something has been mentioned before here about, yeah, do we make a story out of this? And that's an important question because there's something that's called the Backfire Effect. And very simply explained, that means if I present you with something that is factually wrong, but you heard about it and you integrated it into your worldview, you're going to defend it even harder. So the more reason I put onto you and the more explanations I tell you, no, look, this is really wrong, the harder you will try to defend it, which totally doesn't make sense, like from a, let's say, meta perspective now, but in evolutionary terms, that kind of makes sense because you want to keep your integrity, right? And I don't want to go into evolutionary theory here now, but there's certain psychological things that we know now, but that are, I don't want to say completely ignored, but ignored to a large extent. Because now what you see everywhere in the media all over the world is fact-checking. And yes, that is important. but it's not even half of the story. And that's why we started to set up Perspective Daily, like I said, long before, or not long before, but a bit before this whole fake news debate got viral, so to say, because we realized that we have a fundamental problem in society with how we consume and how we get information, starting from this old slogan, bad news is good news, because it gives us a too negative worldview. But also because of these effects like the backfire effect, and that actually creates something that is very dangerous. And if we understand these things, we can actually produce and consume news in, let's say, a more sustainable and more healthy way. And I'm going to stop here because otherwise I'll talk too long.
So everybody's begeistert? So what can we do, Jim Egan? I think I'm a traditional journalist. I do the middle of the road. He said, she said, is this a false balance of journalism? Do we have to more publish to bring up moral outrage, or what do you think?
Yeah, well, I do think in the fake news era, if we're going to continue to use that term, now more than ever, restating our commitment to what quality journalism means, to accuracy, independence, and balance, is important. I think it's really important that those of us who are committed to high-minded, serious standards of journalism don't lose our nerve at this moment. But the problem, perhaps, with notions like independence and impartiality is that they are necessary, but not necessarily sufficient conditions of trust, because trust is this is the holy grail that we're all seeking. And I think, as well as the rational and logical dimensions of trust, there are issues around humanity and empathy as well, which is partly, as Rasmus explained, why people share and read links from people in their network. And therefore, if you leave impartiality to some concept that's too dry and too abstract, you are in a bit of trouble. And therefore, the engagement imperative, whether it's looking at positive, constructive solutions journalism, whether it's about different treatments of stories, whether it's, for example, we do have a BBC reality check service that's been running for 2 years in response to our audience saying, look, you're being a bit equivocal, on one hand and on the other. So, in the Brexit debate, leaving the EU was either going to lead to £350 million extra for the National Health Service, or it wasn't. And helping the audience a little bit to come down on one side of the debate, of course, without leading them. I think these are important directions for us to take.
I see. Rasmus, you made some remarkable advices for journalism. Do you think journalists are interested in advices?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
And that's fine.
No.
My theory of change is very simple. I can't change anything at all. But I hope to help people who want to change their own profession and their own organizations. And I don't believe that I or anybody else has the recipe for reinventing journalism for the 21st century. But I think it's incredibly important that we ask that question, what does that look like? And don't assume that the answer is that it looks like the 20th century just uploaded on a website. Because I think one thing we know is that that is not the right answer. And I'm very encouraged. I'm very encouraged by a journalistic profession that I think in many countries now has a much healthier humility about its own role in society than it's had historically. I think the arrogance and self-confidence of the 90s have faded away along with the profits. I think that is, broadly speaking, good. Though I wouldn't mind a few more full-time journalists in some newsrooms, so the lack of the money might be a bigger issue. I think that there are more and more news organizations and, importantly, more and more individual journalists who don't start from the premise that their audience is stupid and therefore their opinions don't matter, but who have a healthy respect for the idea that maybe you can learn something about how you can make the invisible world visible to the citizen of the modern state by actually trying to listen to the citizen of the modern state and try to understand, what does the world look like from their perspective. I think it's incredibly encouraging to see people with very different backgrounds, sometimes like hardcore investigative journalist backgrounds, but also sometimes people like Maren, who come into journalism from a very different background, or people who come from technology or other places who come in and think, let's take serious this idea that journalism matters. And then let's try to figure out what does it look like for this generation. and not just say, that we'll let the dead hand of tradition dictate what's good and what's right for the future.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Sands, is the behavior changing if you consider the audience of the Spiegel Online? Do your colleagues have had to change, and did they change their attitude towards the audience, or are we still in the beginning?
I think the attitude changes all the time, and it has to do, even faster, as Rasmus pointed out, because in digital journalism you're very much used to analytics and data, and therefore the question what is relevant and what isn't is always a question you have to answer from the audience's perspective, right? That's what you get the facts all the time, so you can't just publish something, a piece, and take no notice whether someone has been reading it or not. And actually, I think that's what journalism is about, that you want to publish things, no matter where you publish it, that is relevant to somebody and reaches an audience. And that's what we have to think about even more, about how you have to write a story, how you have to create a video and whatever content that might be, in a way that it reaches its audience and our different audiences, because it's no longer that one audience. That would be a mistake.
If I may ask all of you, is Erasmus right? Do we have to find or to create new content, another type of content, another quality of content? What do you think, Nadal?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I think broadly speaking, that is right. Yeah, that there is an innovation.
I'm not leaving. I'm just getting.
That's right. I thought you'd had enough.
I'm sorry.
I think there is clearly an innovation imperative. There are very significant and occasionally concerning trends about consumption of news amongst younger audiences, and you've seen some sort of indication of that. On one hand, there's nothing for a mainstream news organization more depressing than hearing a 19-year-old say, "Oh, I just don't tune into the news anymore. I just follow my friends at Instagram or Twitter feed or whatever." But on the other, I think after a decade in which I think there was a degree of political complacency where you saw political participation declining in Europe because to a greater or lesser extent there was a sense that, well, all parties are different versions of the same thing. Even though we're going through disruptive and occasionally scary times, there is political re-engagement and interest amongst younger audiences in what's going on that is unprecedented perhaps for a generation. And I think we should all be encouraged by the fact that people are back on the streets, taking things seriously, prepared to protest either for or against things that are happening. And it's an opportunity for journalism.
Actually, I would like to add to that.
Yeah. Give him a hand.
Actually, yes, adding on to what you said, I think there's a big privilege in something that is happening right now. Back in the day when we had only newspapers, most of us didn't know how this story was being read, if it was being read, minus the studies that were conducted in that area. But right now, in the media ecosystem that we're working in, we get instant feedback. We have data, something that we didn't have back in the day. So we have the opportunity, and this is something to say on a positive note, we learned so much about reader behavior. We know how long the reader spends on a story, so we get instant feedback. Even if the reader doesn't comment on the story, we know, okay, this article is performing very well, but the reader is not spending much time on it, for instance. That actually gives us feedback that we can incorporate back into our newsroom and think about how the story has to look. And this is a big privilege, something that we didn't have before. So I think this is positive.
Yeah. Maybe we are too optimistic on this stage. We are creating a new journalism. We are all very honest. We want to be the good guys. But as you have mentioned, Rasmus, you're told that for example, younger people are using online media, including social media, as main source of news much more than print or TV news. Am I right or am I wrong? Are younger people the preferred target of fake news?
I don't think we know the answer to that, but I would say that if you look more closely at the actual content of the kind of fake news that was quite widespread in the run-up to the American election last year, If you look at the ideological content of that, I would offer to you that that was primarily targeted at older white men and was distributed via social media amongst other platforms, but I don't think that was primarily about younger people. And we should remember also, of course, that overwhelmingly Trump voters were older people, and older people get their news from television, not from social media. I want to say one thing about the future, and I say this without wanting to be complacent about the threats that journalism itself faces. There is no question that the business of journalism is facing some very, very serious pressures. There is no question that in many countries around the world, including some member states of the European Union, there is something that is very close to a war on journalism going on, sometimes backed by political actors, sometimes primarily conducted by organized crime and various other pernicious forces. And there is, as I suggested in my presentation, a very real issue of whether the public connection between the journalistic profession and the public at large is there. But I want to add one thing that is, I think, worth keeping in mind as we think about what journalism, finding truth and reporting it, keeping the public informed, what that might look like in this environment, is that I would challenge you to leave this building and find someone under 40 who doesn't have a direct stake in the question, who think that the media world in which we live today is worse than the one I grew up with in the 90s, with 2 television channels, one of whom was spillover from Swedish state television, the other one of which was Danish state television, 1 regional newspaper and a couple of daily newspapers. I challenge you to go out of this building and find someone who's not a journalist or in advertising, who believe that the media world in which we live in today is worse than that one. I think we have to start from that premise. I think we have to start from that premise that that is a fantastic world from the point of view of most people in the audience, and the question is, what does journalism look like that operates from that premise?
So what do you think, Ms. Hans? Is Erasmus right? Are we still the business under pressure? Under financial pressure, economic pressure, or what else?
I say no, because sticking to your optimistic, well, I think I can't, I'm afraid. I'm afraid he's damn right. Yeah.
Damn right, yeah.
Yeah, of course, there's enormous pressure, there's an enormous digital change with regard to advertising. The majority of advertising money goes to the big US companies, which makes it really hard for smaller media outlets, which is just a fact. And I think what we should stop is we should stop mourning all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're far better off than we used to be in the whole business, but still, yeah, there's a lot of pressure, and I think we can't underestimate that there is a lot of fear about what the answers should be. And obviously, we have an awful lot of questions, all of us, but we don't have the answers. And I think it's just a point in being honest about that one doesn't know. We don't know what journalism will look like in 5 to 10 years, but what is secure is that change won't stop again. We won't be ready, right? We won't be ready in 2 years or in 5 years or in 10 years.
Yeah, I think
that's right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. In connection to the business model, we don't know what the solution is right now, but also in terms of the professional role. I think this is something that we also have to think about more. To be honest and transparent, we do not know everything. And sometimes it might be a good idea to tell the reader, for instance, when you talk to him, we don't know that yet. To get away from this arrogance, this very complacent place that we were in for the past couple of years, that journalists and media people tend to know everything, and I think we have to stop doing that. This is not helping us.
Mm-hmm. So Jim Egan.
So I think anyone who says this is an industry that's not under pressure doesn't know what they're talking about, and anyone who says my business is making loads of money is probably lying. And that's the reality. But those of us who went into journalism to make a bunch of money were probably also seriously misguided. And part of the point is, this is more important than just running a business, and that's why we're here, and that's why we are committed to it. So journalism, is always going to be extremely tough. I think not just for news organizations, but also for regulators and policymakers. There is a question to ask about how you bridge that gap between the clear, demonstrable public value of journalism and the private ability to monetize that. And part of that conversation, needs to include organizations that, not for the first time, are not represented here. Those social media platforms, which are now, whether they like it or not, part of the media industry, if not media businesses, and every other player who is a significant channel or platform for people's consumption of news, participates in a policy context or a regulatory environment of one sort or another. And clearly, the big technology giants have been on a journey, as we euphemistically say, over the last 12 months or so. But that journey will end at some stage with a recognition of the enormous role that they play in the media consumption diet of people around the world, and therefore in the democratic evolution of the societies we live in.
So, Jim Egan, who will survive, the BBC or Google? Who will survive, BBC or Google, or both?
Well, obviously the diplomatic answer to that has to be both, but I think it makes sense for serious journalistic organizations to be confident about and rededicating themselves to their future. And although Google and Facebook and others are being dragged from being technology companies into media companies, let's not lose sight of ourselves. We are the organizations with the newsrooms. We are where editorial control sits. And I think we would be shortchanging ourselves on our responsibility if we argue too hard that Google and Facebook and everyone else needs to take full responsibility for this. We have responsibility, we have expertise and professionalism, and we should rededicate ourselves to that.
Okay. So if you got So if you got any question, please raise your hand. Go to the microphone. I see. Oh yes, I'm very sorry, sir. You may say your name and your.
Simon Menner. I'm an artist. Based in Berlin. I think you mix two things. You mix the topic of fake news and the topic of credibility. Just because this moron Donald Trump mixed it somehow during this press conference when calling the CNN fake news. And the problem is you try to reach credibility in the society and at the same time have the widest reach possible. And that's why, for instance, Spiegel Online lost me quite some time ago. I had to delete the app when I realized, well, oh really, they are going to report on every single episode of Jungle Camp. And so, and also you alter and you change headlines constantly, which is a reaction to your ability, what Nidal said, your wonderful ability to track the user and the time they spend on certain sites. But what you do is you end up competing on a clickbait level with everyone who also produces clickbait articles. And that really causes you to lose credibility within society. And necessarily, if you look on on charts and research on which news sites are the most credible, even in the United States, is sites like Mother Jones, who have nearly no reach but still are considered credible. So rethink if you want to follow a strict business model or if you want to do quality journalism, you might not be able to combine both. And that's a problem, but here you're acting. It might not be the right panel to discuss the final solution. Oh, no, I shouldn't say that in German. And the good solution for how to solve the problem of online journalism. Maybe you have to shrink more than you already did, but be good journalists.
So Mr. Sands, you did the Jungle Camp. What did you do?
Well, I first wanted to answer to the second point because I think it's more important. Shrinking means less journalists, right? What would your answer be to that? I mean, how would you finance? We don't have public service broadcasting for digital things in Germany, so how would you finance that? But of course, that's the way newspapers and broadcasting work throughout the decades, that you have to have a certain reach in order to earn the money. That's a business, right? It's not publicly funded, but a business model behind it. So I wouldn't blame for that, really. What I agree with is that clickbaiting does cost you credibility. Of course it does. But a headline which reaches more people isn't necessarily the worst one. And a headline which doesn't reach a lot of people doesn't make it a better headline. There's no logic behind that. We could certainly debate on the jungle camp and on your understanding of what entertaining is. I'm fine with that, but that's with regard to all the sort of softer topics you have on a website. And I'm fine with that, and I'm fine if you don't like it. That's an offer, right? Any sort of media outlet gives you an offering on information, and you can choose where you get your information from. But I can say that I need a certain amount of journalists to have a certain quality of journalism, really, because who else would do it? I need a certain net of correspondence to report from different places in the world, to have a good reporting from Turkey, for example, to have a good reporting from Moscow. And all these people have to be paid for.
Maren?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we separate between not necessarily credibility and fake news, but between the business model behind journalism. And I think we all agree that that's dramatically changing, and anybody who claims that they know what's going to look like in 5 years, nobody should believe that person, because I think the more you know it, the more you know that you don't know what it's going to look like. So that's one aspect, and that's of course related to trust and credibility. But the other aspect is, how do we work? How do we create? And we've talked about both things, and I think it's a bit mixed up now at this stage in the panel. So maybe we can try to separate a bit more clearer. And I think it's important that the finance is really stable. And of course, if you think about how is journalism financed, you can basically quickly come up with 3 solutions. It's either state-financed, or it's financed by the readers, or advertisement, or mixture. And for example, with Perspective Daily, we decided, okay, we want to be as independent as possible from influence from anybody else, so we're solely financed by our readers. Because if we are honest, advertisement is on this scale, or let's say that end of the scale, the interest of people who want to make money with their company, and independent journalism is at the other end of the table. And they just don't work together. And we have to admit that at a certain point. And they're not going to work together in the future, not online, not in print, no anywhere. And there's studies out there that show that whether people claim that they're independent, when they work together with advertisement, it influences their reporting. So that's why we decided, okay, we want to work with a member-based or member-financed model, because that allows us to report as independently as possible. Of course, we're independent of a lot of people because they pay for the journalism we make. And on the other hand, it's about how we create information, how we create the reporting we do. And then we like to talk about what we call evidence-based journalism. And I know this sounds like nerdy and science-based, but it's really important, because we talked about honesty, and some people here on the panel mentioned it as well. Show like how far you got, where you hit a closed door, where you don't know, and take the reader by the hand instead of showing off. And I think when Rasmus said that he's very optimistic about journalists being less, I don't want to say male, white, whatever, middle-aged dominant. I don't think that that's true. Sorry, I don't share your optimism there, because the journey I made with Perspective Daily, and we all made on our team during the last 2 years, that was exactly that issue, that problem that we were facing the most, that there's these dinosaur structures where people think they're going to do whatever they've been done for the last decades for the rest of their lives, and then they don't care what's happening afterwards. So I'm very pleased to see there's a very mixed panel here, because there's lots of people thinking about the future and don't want to give the future to the hands of these dinosaurs. But I think we have to separate these two things, even though they're, of course, related, because one person finances the work of the others.
Sir, you may.
Thank you. I'm John from Norway. Thank you for an inspiring session, and particularly Rasmus for a good introduction. I have a question to the BBC Global News representative. You come from London, from, no, let me start a little differently.
Wonder where this is going.
There is a danger in introducing the fake news concept. That is, news are either correct or wrong. We know that news are in a long spectrum, a lot of perspectives and callers. And Jimigan, BBC says it's best on global perspectives. Global perspectives. What the heck is global perspective? You come from the capital of an old empire. You come from the mother of all tax havens, but you pretend coming with a global perspective. What is that?
Okay. The BBC started broadcasting outside the UK at the end of the 1920s. The motto of the organization, which sounds very pompous these days, but hopefully you'll forgive it, was "Nation shall speak peace unto nation." We're based in London. We work in 40 languages in addition to English. We have more journalists in more countries than any other news broadcaster around the world. We have an explicit editorial agenda, which means we are not dedicated on news for British expats. You don't get the English cricket scores on the BBC internationally. And for that reason, because we bring more stories from more places around the world, that we are committed to ongoing coverage of Syria. We have journalists in Mosul and elsewhere, just to give you a couple of examples. Our dedication to the global agenda is something that's been with us since the organization started nearly 90 years ago. We can argue about it later if you want. British is clearly in the name, but global news is what we do.
So, sir, are you satisfied, or are you...
I mean, I have to admit, I'm addicted to BBC World, and I listen to it every night. So that's not the problem. But I think to give this impression that news can be totally new, global, with its perspective. You have a British perspective on the globe, that's different. And you put your representatives all around on the globe. You're probably better than most. CNN had an advertisement yesterday where they said, we never took sides in a war. No, we're not CNN, you know. People older than 10 years know how CNN reported, you know, with their embedded journalists and so on. And I'm not quite sure. I think also BBC has embedded journalism in its stable. So, but thank you.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Maybe you'll have another face-to-face conversation with Jim. So thank you very much indeed, and give this wonderful panel a big hand.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you.
And thank you very much indeed. And now, folks, it's now your turn. You see the Q&R code. You have to evaluate this wonderful panel. If you do more likes, I get more money, so don't be shy. And thank you very much for joining. And we did Jungle Camp 2, just not for reason clickbaiting. It's just a very important question of how to entertain people. Thank you very much. Have a great night. Thank you very much.